experience climate security risks? What is that meaning for you, let's say, from the Indian perspective, but also from the international relations perspective? And what do you see as ways to address it?
Yeah, thank you so much. And if I have to talk about climate security from an Indian or like broader South Asian perspective, because there are a lot of similarities between the types of risks that different South Asian countries face today. And I would probably start with the heat wave, because I think this has been in news. Everybody has heard about the scorching temperatures that India and countries like Pakistan and others have faced in recent months. And the way I look at climate and security linkages in South Asia, it's more in terms of the compound and the systemic risks that climate change poses to security and in different ways. So I wouldn't say that this is just about direct or indirect threats. It's about how climate change has these systemic sort of impacts on different systems that are there. So it's about health systems, food systems, energy systems, and the heat wave, how it kind of affected all these different systems was very evident, starting with, of course, the health was something that is obviously most discussed, but also let's not forget that if it affected food production in a big way, which also had its impact on India's decision to stop exports of wheat, which was overall affected with the Russia-Ukraine situation right now. I think one of the most important factors, which is a big concern, as I was also talking about it earlier, is about water security. And I think water is a huge concern for the Indian government and also for the local governments, because water scarcity, which is directly affecting agricultural productivity, industrial productivity, and urban centers, which, by the way, India is urbanizing really fast. And, there is more and more requirement for water. So water security is affected. And in effect, it also has ripple effects on mobility patterns. It also has effects on urbanization and livelihoods in particular. So in the recent heat wave as well, if you saw a lot of people who work in the informal sectors. Let's remember that, a large proportion of the population in countries like India, they work in the informal sectors. So that really affects people who just lose their livelihoods overnight. They are working in the agricultural sector. They are in, maybe construction sector. They are directly exposed to the kind of heat waves that the country is facing. So in that sense, the precarity of labor and precarity of survival is something that becomes acute in countries like India and the other South Asian countries as well. And along with that, what also India faced was a huge energy crisis. And this also has a broader geopolitical sort of picture with what's happening in Ukraine, and also with the heat wave. The coal crisis was something that the country faced. So all these issues kind of show you that this is like a systemic risk. Climate change poses these risks at different levels to people in different parts of the country. And of course, India is a huge country with different vulnerabilities. So heat wave is just one of them. Extreme weather events have obviously risen in number and frequency and intensity. Of course, a lot of steps have been taken in the recent past with renewable energy deployment and various other adaptation measures. Some cities in particular have come up with heat action plans. But then the pace at which climate is changing, the measures don't really match that, So, I mean, because the measures will have to be much, much faster than that, because the way climate is changing, you will have to do much, much faster. And this means there is a global obligation as well, which is something that we have to keep in mind. But yeah, I'm happy to discuss about it later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danashree. Ambassador van den Berg, if you listen to this, do you recognize this, and also do you see the government in Delhi also paying attention to this as a matter of priority? And how is a country like the Netherlands able to relate to this issue in the Indian context?
Thank you so much. And of course, very much recognize what was just described, although in a few minutes describing all of India is quite a challenge. But I think, yeah, two things as more or less facts. About 80% of India is vulnerable to climate-related extreme events. And then we talk about 1.3, 1.4 billion people. So it's quite a huge challenge, so to say. And as we also saying, I think all the risks are very much related. So there is a huge, what I would say, risk relationship between the different risks, whether it's in water, in agriculture, in security, in well, socio-economic stability, etc., etc. I think if you would ask or talk with Indian ministers behind closed doors, they all recognize the huge challenges they face. And I think if you would ask them, well, if you would ask them, because we did, of course, what is your main concern? It's about water. The water shortages, the water security, whether it's in the agricultural sector, whether it's in urban environments. That's a huge, huge challenge. And if you see what is happening already in the last 5 or 10 years, for example, with the groundwater level, it went down several meters. I mean, we're talking about huge challenges. At the same time, well, where there's a crisis, there is also a challenge and an opportunity. And where we are working from the Netherlands on 3 sectors in a way to increase, to strengthen the adaptive capacity of India. Of course, water, agriculture, and energy transition. Also, for example, in Khirallah, this in the southern part of India, they had huge floodings already several times. So a few years ago, the Kerala government came to the Netherlands asking, can you support, help us working together on dealing with water management in a way, addressing the huge water management issue. And of course, then you also have to work at the same time in the agricultural sector, because water and agricultural challenges are so much connected with each other. So we do a lot of work on water, for example, in the state of Kerala, but also in urban environment. Chennai is a city which has on the one hand, confronted with the rising sea level, a huge drought. So about maybe 6-7 weeks, they have a lot of heavy rainfall. So there are a lot of floodings in the city of Chennai, and the rest of the year there is a huge drought, and then they bring in water with the trains or working on desalination. And then what we have done with the Netherlands and the municipality, that in a way we found out if you store and save the water over those 6 weeks, you have sufficient water for the rest of the year. So you can, what we call, close the water loop. And we work closely with the city of Chennai to indeed make that possible. So that's a few concrete examples, but also now on the agricultural sector, working with, of course, University of Wageningen, changing kind of crop varieties to make more water resistance, or crops which are more resilient in saline regions, or using less water, or even working with different crops. I mean, rice is quite water intensive. And if you think about what is India exporting, I mean, if it's exporting rice, basically it's exporting water. And it's crazy that a country with such a huge water scarcity is basically exporting water. So we try to change this as well together. And finally, the energy transition, working very much on one hand on mapping technologies in a way to see in certain sectors like cement and steel, which are very carbon intensive, and change their way of producing with new technologies, but also working on solar and very much on offshore wind. And we do it always with the NGOs together and with the private sector and the government of India, the federal as well as the state government.
So what is so specific about the Planetary Security Initiative is that it's not a, let's say, climate-only project. We always try to establish also the link with what it means for geopolitics and security, also for the security actors and the foreign policy communities in countries. And I know in India there is resistance to this securitization issue because it's considered too alarmistic and also in a way a bit American. So how do you see this issue? Do you say it's more an issue? It's better maybe to depoliticize the climate change issue, or no, there is a real security dimension, and it's also valuable if you look from this security foreign policy perspective also to these climate change issues that you just talked about.
Yeah, I think they very much recognize, acknowledge that there is a huge security dimension to it as well. Maybe sometimes they feel a little bit hesitant or reluctant to say that in public. What we use is the SDGs because the Netherlands and India both are very much committed. India maybe even more than the Netherlands actually, and also they really try to connect this, to integrate it in their policy agenda. So the language of SDGs is perfect language to connect with Indian governments, whether it's on the state, on the municipality, as the federal level. And that's a perfect framework to work together on similar challenges. So I think framing it a little bit more differently with India makes the dialogue and the collaboration far more effective than frame it sometimes maybe too much in security issues. But basically, you're working on the same challenges and issues and transitions.
And the final word for you, how do you view the securitization debate? What is the added value to look also from the security lens at the climate impacts in the region?
So yeah, I agree with the ambassador about linking climate with security. It's a more geopolitical issue, why India is reluctant to do that, and this has been a historical position. But in terms of what is the added advantage of doing that, I think at the regional level there are real security challenges with respect to river water sharing, with regard to mobility patterns, which are still not recorded enough. There is
migration issue of the rail.
Yes, migration issue. I mean, it's not just intra-state migration, which is already happening on a massive scale. People migrating from coastal areas to interior areas, or from rural areas to urban areas, but also there are temporary migration patterns across borders as well, which needs to be addressed. So I think there are these human security challenges which require a regional approach, wherein India needs to kind of have a leadership role. It needs to discuss this with its neighbors, because especially with water security becoming such a major challenge, all these rivers, mostly in the Gangetic, Indo-Gangetic plains, are shared. So there needs to be dialogue between the countries over variabilities or in terms of the water availability in all these river basins. And this cannot be done just at the national level. It needs to be a transboundary level dialogue. So yes, there is a security challenge, and it doesn't have to be a certain type of security as the way everybody discusses it. It is something that affects large sections of the population that depend on these waters. So I think it's something that India needs to take more seriously. And of course, the regional organizations which haven't been as successful in discussing climate challenges need to actually bring up more and more often in these discussions. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We have to move on to our next case study, the case of Iraq. The ambassador will have to leave us, but Danashree is still around for if there's questions later on the climate security front and for the drinks that we have afterwards. Thank you so much for sharing this perspective. I think some of the issues that we heard, we will also recognize in the other two cases, because so often the climate security issues are similar, but I think there's also differences between, let's say, the India case where climate security unfolds in a relatively stable country in comparison to the Horn of Africa and the Iraq case that we are going to talk about. Thank you so much. So yes, I'm joined here with Salman Khirallah from Humat Dijlah, an NGO from Iraq, and we're really pleased to have you here to talk about climate security, because of also in light of our own activities in the south of Iraq, in which we work together a lot with your organization and other organizations, and with Ambassador Michel Rentenaar, also really almost a friend of the Planetary Security Initiative of the Clingendael Institute. And it is always very easy to discuss with Ambassador Rentenaar about the climate security issue, because he has been climate envoy for a number of years and a security background in NATO. So I usually feel that I don't have to explain anything, which I don't try to explain too much to people. That's womansplaining, we can say. Yeah, that's always, and I'm also always very interested in listening to you because you visit, for instance, the south of Iraq in the past years at several intervals, and you also saw some of the differences that happened. But Salman, if you allow, let me start with you. Could you say something? You are a human rights NGO director. How do you experience the climate security issue in your country?
So yeah, thank you so much. And in the beginning, first of all, it's my privilege and very pleasure to be here today and talk to you about, especially you give me 3 minutes for a country that's 24 international channel, they cannot cover it in one day, what's happening in it. But anyway, like I will manage to cover something about Iraq challenge, especially with the climate change security and what we are facing right now actually in Iraq. First of all, Iraq is still from 5 years ago till now still in the fifth stage, like the fifth country around all the world affected by the climate change, most affected by climate change, not create climate change. We didn't affect anyone else, but we are affected from the big countries around all the world. But at the same time, we have a lot of challenge internally that we cannot fix it, and we need to work on it also. Anyway, okay. Yeah. So anyway, actually, the climate security in Iraq affecting the local community. The past few years, it might be affecting only the poor families, which is the people living in the very local communities. But now, no, even the rich families, they start to facing the climate security and how is affecting all the people right now. The affecting of the people in many of way, like affecting the people with the water crisis. And what we have actually is really big water crisis, especially the Iraq location in the area in the Middle East, in the middle of the Mesopotamia. Also, it's also affecting is not only by the climate change. With our neighbor country, we have a lot of issues with the water issues. So we have a problem with the water security, it's a really big problem. It's create a lot of challenge with the climate change, especially in the downstream part in Basra, Nasriya, and Misan, which is the central marsh and all the Iraqi marshes, which is most beautiful area. You might saw that in the internet, but for the people who visit this area, it might be really, if you see it closely to the people, you will see something, it's heaven. But unfortunately, we lost this. And we lost the community in this area. One of the main problems that we are facing by the climate change right now in Iraq is the displacement. We have hundreds of families, they are displacement from their housing. All this kind of point, it's need to stop to talk about it. We have a problem now with the food security. For the previous few years, we didn't export not that much of the food of like vegetables or fruit. Now even the government, they allow all the border to open all the border around all Iraq, from 4 countries around Iraq, to export all the fruit, all the vegetables again, because we don't have enough water for anything. Iraq in 1996, we were export our date, our palm tree to all around the world. Now, unfortunately, in Basra, we are eating a Saudian or Iranian dates. Just imagine what we are facing right now. And this is small things to talk about the climate change and food security and water security in Iran. I don't want to talk more. Mr. Michel.
Thank you. Yeah, Michel. Maybe also try to focus on what we can do about it. Yeah, what can we do about this? Yeah.
No, good. Let me start first. I will not add anything to the severity of the problem. I think, Salman, you covered this very well. Obviously, first I want to start with something positive. I think it's really positive that a country like Iraq has developed an NDC. That was one of the results out of the Paris Treaty, of course, that countries would describe a nationally determined contribution. So that's very good. On the less positive side is that the awareness, let's say, of how these issues are linked, as you were saying, Louise, before, is not so well developed, let's say. There is much to be gained from that. Obviously, some international actors, and the Planetary Security Initiative is certainly one of them, are starting this. Ma and myself, we organized, for instance, a meeting in the embassy 2 or 3 weeks ago in Baghdad, and we brought together some obvious actors, so Ministry of Environment, Iraqi Ministry of Environment, Water, Agriculture, but also the Ministry of Interior. That's an odd guest. That is not happening all over the world, let's say. So the beginning is there. And certainly if you look at the south, the situation is quite bad. For instance, if you look at the city Basra, it's the second biggest city in Iraq, its population has tripled in the last 7 or 8 years. That's due to the migration from the rural countryside, where it has just become impossible to grow anything. Some of it is reasons from outside. Yes, the Turks have built dams, the Iranians have built dams, there's less water coming in, but some of it is also very, very poor management. And in a country, I'm sorry I have to underline this, in a country which is the second biggest oil exporter in the world after Saudi Arabia, that pumps out $2 billion a week. How much is our budget deficit in this country? 10? They would cover it in 5 weeks. So $2 billion coming out of the ground, specifically in that region as well. Most of it, 90% is coming out of the Basra region. It is still happening that, for instance, the feeder channels into Shatt al-Arab, that's more or less the biggest waterway there in the south, are not covered. 30–40% of the water just poof, evaporates. I was in Baghdad last week, it was 47 degrees, ahlan wa sahlan. You know, it's really, all the water just goes out. And this is an easy problem to solve. So some of them are technical solutions. Obviously, I represent the Netherlands in that country, and so I don't have to do the sales pitch here, but the Netherlands is, of course, very, very good in water management. We're the second largest agricultural exporter in the world, and we have all the knowledge. Wageningen, Deltares, you name it, it's all there. So all of that can be supplied, let's say, to Iraq, but it's not happening yet. And this is one of the things that I'm trying to achieve, to see how in my communications with the Iraqi government, I can basically entice them or stimulate them, let's say, to start saying, let's use some of that oil money of you and buy some of the solutions on the adaptation side of climate, let's say. But there's more things that we can do. This week, as you were saying, we had our annual ambassadors conference. One of the sub-sessions that I was in was called From the Dubai Expo to the COP 27. In climate land, we have an interesting situation. The next two conference of parties, that's how these big climate meetings are called, the COPs, are in the Arab world. Later this year in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, and then a year from now in the Emirates. So that's a chance, that's an opportunity. And I was sitting in a room with a number of these typical Dutch big business people, and they were all happy about the expo. Fantastic, we're going to make money, fantastic. And I said, have you realized the amazing opportunity you have that Iraq, again, second biggest oil exporter in the world with some cash, actually, in the next two COPs, if you would just use some of that fantastic presentations that you did in the expo, why don't you use that on a combination of both the Iraqi official delegation to the COPs and also the civil society? And that's where these two things come together, because that's exactly what Ma and myself did in this Basra forum, to bring these two actors together. There are actors in Iraq, of course, civil society, all sorts of academics as well, that are aware of the issues, that have ideas on this. And you just need to merge that with the Iraqi official delegation, let's say, and then cuddle them a little bit in the COP, whatever. It's going to cost about $10,000 US. It won't be expensive. But then suddenly you have 20 ambassadors, Iraqi ambassadors, who are interested in buying Dutch solutions for the climate problem. 1 and 1 is suddenly 3. That, I think, is one of the things which can come out of this kind of project.
Yeah, thank you. And also, I guess what we experience in our activities in the south of Iraq, that also the forum and the meetings that we organize, we discover that some of the people we invite don't usually talk to each other. So that can also be a way to bring, let's say, representatives from different groups in society, different ethnical or groups where they're coming from political affiliations together to talk about a common enemy, climate change, the climate change issue in the dialogues. And I think that's what we try to achieve as well, and with the involvement of the local stakeholders. Yeah, I think in the sake of time, I would like to go ahead with also the Horn of Africa case, but I hope that there will be a few questions from the audience for you then also later on. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. I'm joined here by Arrliya Sugal from the Berghof Foundation in Berlin, also so courageous to take the train from Berlin. The Berghof Foundation is a big peace building mediation organization, active in different parts of the world, among which in the Horn of Africa and Somalia. I'm also joined here with Maarten Brouwer, the Netherlands ambassador to Kenya, but also to Somalia. We already met on Tuesday evening at the reception of the ambassadors conference, and we talked about the severe food security situation that's now ongoing in the Horn of Africa. I also have a Jos Meester colleague here in the room who works also on the Horn of Africa, Somalia, and is currently doing research also on climate impacts in the country and the region. And yeah, this really has our attention. We think it's really an issue that deserves more attention. But also, what can you do in such a super difficult country where the governance system is really kind of has collapsed already for a couple of years? Can you still undertake action in this field of climate security? Can you use climate for peace building purposes and for addressing this severe food security situation? So, Arrliya, I would like to start with you to hear your reflections on this issue, please.
Thank you. Absolutely, there are many opportunities to engage with the local community, but let me start by saying, painting a picture of what we're talking about. In Somalia, currently, we are we faced already 4 consecutive droughts, and now are at risk of facing a 5th failed raining season. In concrete terms, this means 7 million people affected by severe food insecurity and the drought emergency. We're talking about 800,000 people already displaced in the country due to this despair. And we are also 80% of them being women and children. So it's very grim. And of course, like countless cattle and livestock, the main source of income for the communities of Somalia already perished due to this. So we are facing, as always, but particularly now in Somalia, a very difficult humanitarian crisis. The biggest issue with Somalia, maybe in this case, was that communities are pretty much exposed to these risks without any safety net. A fragile country such as Somalia, where the government system has failed them to some extent in the last couple of decades, young people or people in general are facing a situation where they have to fend for themselves, usually this along the family lines, along the clan lines. This, however, has a risk of bringing in conflicts in some cases, especially when it comes to resources and when it comes to survival at that point. In terms of climate security, we can say that climate change is impacting the security landscape of Somalia in overt and in covert terms. Concretely, it's lowering the thresholds for conflict, for hard conflicts in certain regions by triggering these insecurities, by exacerbating the grievances that already exist. as the stakes rise with access to key resources and food systems, water systems, communities are pretty much pushed into difficult situations and they have to do impossible decisions. Sometimes these decisions can be adverse, what we call adverse coping strategies. In that sense, communities engaging in conflict also, but also in destroying the environment, such as the cutting down of trees and forests, which is very important for climate change adaptation.
Yeah, so coping strategy is also to engage in conflict.
Yes.
Yeah, that's really very destructive. Yeah. No, thank you. Ambassador Brouwer, how do you look at the situation from Nairobi, overseeing the Horn of Africa, and also, are there also things we have learned from the previous rounds of hunger in the 1980s and the efforts on climate security? Yeah, because across the Sahel we see this issue of herders and farmers basically competing over the same ever scarce lands and grazing lands and resources, the same water resources. And do you also see a perspective of where, like Michel Rentenaar pointed out, where a country like the Netherlands or the European approach can help to assist in such situations?
Well, yeah, thank you. And just to underline how serious the situation is, what we're looking at, what I would call a famine, and I know there are definitional questions, but if people start dying, it's a famine, in my opinion. And that is the case. And it is often compared to the worst famine that struck the area in 2011-12, in which some 250,000 people died. And those are also the numbers we anticipate to die in this drought. So it's the fourth consecutive drought, and we think that will be the number, more or less, which is horrible. If you know that beforehand, and you feel powerless to avoid it. So that's the first remark on the seriousness. The second remark, I think, is I'm just having a few remarks that are not necessarily all logically combined, but just some reflections. Would it be possible for the three countries, it's Ethiopia and Somalia and Kenya, for instance, that ministers would now come to meet and discuss the problem together? No way. Because there are other problems, like the difficult situation between Somalia and Kenya, the difficult situation on Ethiopia, and if those, let's say, presidents or ministers meet, they will talk about Tigray and they will not talk about the southwest part of Ethiopia. So that's telling you also something about the political priority it gets. It's just not an issue, even though 250,000 people may die. It's not something that the ministers will meet for themselves. So I think that is an issue. It already came up in the two previous contributions that this drought, people often start to talk about water. Yes, water is really, of course, water is a problem, because otherwise the drought they could have accommodated to. But there are other problems. The solution is not only to tap more water and to get more water from below the surface. You can drill deeper every time. In many parts of the area, you will need saline water resources. So then you need also to desalinize the water. You will need a lot of power for that. You don't have the power in the area, so you need solar. So, you know, as soon as you start to think about in terms of solutions, a huge chain of activities is needed to start to address it. And that is beside the point that actually there's a lot of problem in the economic system. In all those areas that we talk about, these areas, but also in Kenya, there are other areas and other parts of the world, and you said it yourself on the Sahel, where I also lived. Often it is a nomadic, the pastoralist system that is the basis, the heartbeat of the life of people. Now you cannot just change overnight the economic system and all cultural aspects that are related to it, but it is a reality that system is based on free fodder. You just go out and graze on land, and it's being overgrazed and overgrazed. And there is no organization in that system. So if the lands that your cattle is going to are completely grazed, you go to the ones of the neighbor, and you go a step further, and you go a step further. So the rate of overgrazing is accelerating continuously, and that is very, very difficult to stop. So there is also something about that economic system. So yes, we need to look at what we need to look at the economic system. Those are a few observations. Then what I saw is that if you one of the observations also that, let's say 10, 15 years ago, also the donor community started to do a lot of work on resilience building for those very vulnerable communities. And I'm not saying that money was wasted, because I think there were a lot of good activities. But what we also can see is that the pace of building up resilience have not met the pace of the climate change effect. So the gap is widening continuously. Also, you can ask some questions about what were exactly the resilience components of the strategies that were applied, and what we often hear, we go to county level and we talk to local representatives, they are not heard, and that they do have ideas about solutions. And I think that is really now a very urgent step to take. If we start to talk about resilience, is go to the communities and listen to what they think is what they need. That's one part of it. And second part of it, if we cannot keep up the pace of climate change and building up resilience with climate change, there is an issue of scaling up. So and that's then you start to come at the area of what can donors do and what can countries do. But then if we bring in, there's a lot of technology. And Michel already mentioned a number of companies, and there are so many more also in the Netherlands that can play a role. But if they come with their programs based on death studies and surveys from a long distance and go to do the interventions, it will not help. They need to go and build on what's locally felt as something that's really important, and that is becoming sustainable because the local community is owner of it. And then think in terms of, and how can you then scale up things that are successful at village level? How can you then scale up? And many of the larger scale projects are often being dreamt up outside of the area where they are applied, and that is a problem. So, and then finally, a lot of the water problems is not only the direct access to water in terms of drilling it up or having water source, but also how can you strengthen the water tables on the surface? Where are the water towers? Where are the forests or the mountains? And where is the runoff of water? And how it is being catch that water? And those are the biggest schemes, and that's where many of the donors come in. So that's a little bit a few of the observations.
Thank you. I think I saw my colleague Jos Meester, but also Lila Koning from the Clingendael Academy nodding about the need to engage this local level and to involve them also. And I think we also try to do that from the Clingendael side. Well, we already heard about the Iraq example where we go to the south where not so many others are going. I wondered about your remark that it's so difficult to get the three countries together on this issue, Ethiopia, Somalia, and Kenya. And I wondered if both of you see a role for bringing then foreign policy and security actors in, because in these countries, usually these are quite powerful actors. But we see in this field among environmentalists and climate adaptation specialists and development cooperation specialists, for legitimate reasons, very often also a lot of resistance to engage with, let's say, security actors, both at national level and at local level, local militia, for instance. But we sometimes wonder, in a country like Somalia, how can you operate without engaging with them? Is it possible to do it? And can you say a few words maybe about this dilemma that we observe?
Yes, difficult question, particularly in the case of Somalia. I think with the new administration just inaugurated in Somalia, I think it is important to give them a fighting chance to consolidate and build them. But then once again, of course, the international community is in responsibility to broker and to support the engagement between these three areas, particularly when it comes to sharing of key resources such as water. We have the Shabelle River, we have the Juba River, which is across Ethiopia and Somalia, and this needs to be discussed. However, we've observed in the past already that engagements that have been, or initiatives in a similar way, they start, there is some momentum going on, and then they figure out somehow, right? And the question is, how can we sustain them in a long-term way and bring effective change, and this change not only on the national level, but also across all different levels. And at the end of the day, effective measures reaching the local communities to adapt accordingly.
Yeah, right, thanks.
Yeah, well, we are actually at the moment, we have people from the side of the military to look in what is the connection from, let's say, security to environment, and let's wait what comes out of that. But the point is very much, if you look at Somalia, it is very insecure area, of course. And we have the operators there, we have sometimes clashes between clans, but the most important one is, of course, with Al-Shabaab. And that's the main issue. So there is a lot of, let's say, on the security side, the repressive capacity that is being deployed in the field. And if you look at security from the wider perspective, I think there is a very logical connection to be made. But in particular for the Somalia question, it's also whether the repressive side of security is what type of factor is that with respect to the drought at the moment and the climate change. And I think that is a huge question. I don't have a simple answer to that. But let me say, if you provide more access to water, for instance, that is not only valuable to the population, that is also valuable in military terms, and therefore you have to continuously think about the conflict sensitivity of the operations in an area like that. Many of the conflicts in Somalia, they are not being caused by the drought and water tables, but they are intertwined.
Peter Knopen nodding, Clingendael, Senior Associate Fellow, having lived and worked in Africa and also active in the Sahel region, very recognizable, I see. Yeah, thank you. I wanted to open up for questions for the audience. I want to emphasize that you can also ask questions for the other speakers, but I would like to ask you to briefly state your name and also keep it short, because we have very little time. We still do this in a kind of Zoom spirit of 1 hour. We will probably go over time a little bit, and we have some drinks afterwards. So there will also be the opportunity to talk to some of the people during this informal encounter. Who is daring after these words to pose a question? Yeah, please, Fred.
Yes, Fred Cargos, I'm a biologist. Well, actually, the last sentences that you spoke about that. So the implementation of military capacity within the whole context. You mentioned the factor increases affecting the landscape, etc. Those are all ingredients. If you look at these effects from an ecological point of view, which we actually all depend on the interrelationships of all organisms, which are just one species of. Well, if you look at that point from this holistic point, and you think about how can we use military capacity, then the role of the military will have to change. So I call this inter-conflict operations. So my question to you is, what kind of relations do you see in the context of the area of your responsibility in the context of bringing in some military forces, and what should they do to adapt to this holistic view?
Whoa, small question, easy to answer. And maybe also a relevant question for Michel Rentenaar.
Actually, it's the same. It's arid, or going into an arid area full of conflict. The title of the book is also Climate Change, Conflict, Displacement, Nexus from a humanitarian perspective. So it's very relevant. So then I ask the same question to your colleague. What's your opinion about what the military should do to become part of the tools that you have other than bringing in violence?
So the often addressed question, you know, militaries are not NGOs, but what would be their role in such a...
Yeah, well, I'm tempted now to go back to a previous experience that I had, and I don't know what's going to be applicable, and I hope you can help us here. Also for the Somalia context, I also worked for 5 years in Mali, where we had, of course, the peacekeeping operation and the military there. And one of the special things that the Dutch military did there is just to take out their weapon and go out to the communities and talk to them. Now, there were military with weapons around to provide for the security, but they actually tried to talk to the people. But they did not come in a threatening way, to try to find that engagement and try to learn about what is happening here and what is important. And this is where I would say the integrated approach becomes very, very important. To listen and to understand that sometimes you need to do something completely different than you would expect. In some circumstances, even if people are dying, etc., you have to build a school. And it is that openness that you must have. And that is a little bit what I mentioned. If you go in with the repressive mechanism, you have to organize the repressive mechanism in a different way than a traditional military way. And use your presence, your force, and the security that you can provide at that moment to help open up a little bit of the dialogue, and to see whether you can get more information and broader information than just going there and show your weaponry and provide the security, which will only be there for the 6 hours that the military are there, and then they move out, and then they are even more insecure than before. I think that should be the person to really think through how can you use that military force to allow for a certain level of security that can also generate a dialogue to really dig into what the problems are.
Different answer in my case, or in the context of Iraq, because there's one thing that Iraq doesn't need is any more forestry. So definitely that's not the answer, and neither of the Iraqi army itself. That doesn't mean that that's not a very serious security game. As I said before, in the last 7 to 10 years, the population of the south was more or less migrated from the countryside, was becoming increasingly impossible to grow anything because it was so saline and the temperature has risen. And it's just become unlivable. They moved to the city. And Basra is the second biggest city in Iraq. It now has a population of 5 million, not more. And the infrastructure cannot cope with that at all. Basra is actually a city, not like Amsterdam. It has canals, and these canals are basically so built because the system just can't cope with that enormous influx of population. So there are many, basically what we would call environmental problems. And the people don't see the difference between the environment and climate so much. But one is very much climate induced. Yeah. And it is therefore no surprise that during the extreme, so that's the name for the big protest movement, let's say, in 2019 most. That led to the resignation of the prime minister of the country. It also happened not just in Baghdad, but mostly also in Basra and in Nasiriyah, in cities in the south that have been affected by this. And that is exactly the reason why when Maarten we organized this network meeting, bringing people together. It wasn't just the Ministry of environment, water, and agriculture sitting in the table. It was also the Ministry of Interior. Because that realization has landed in the Iraqi government, but there is a necessity to look at the implications of those issues. And therefore, I think we also have a very strong argument. And that's why I make that plea to the Iraqi government every time. Look at the dangers of this, see what we can do about it, and let's mitigate the risks of climate change, because it has very much a security element as well. But so it's saying not really.
Danashree, you've also looked in that in your PhD and in the books and in the papers that you've published a lot. How is this viewed from the Indian perspective? A country with very strong armed forces, a lot of engagement in peacekeeping missions in other parts of the world. Could you say just a few words about this?
Yeah, I mean, so if you look at South Asia, it's not devoid of conflicts. There are a lot of conflicts, whether it's India-Pakistan border or India-China border. You know, there are active conflicts which are still going on, especially between the militaries. And what militaries are mostly concerned about in India, or say like when it comes to climate change, is obviously about the impacts of climate change on their own populations, say the borderlands. I think that's what they're mostly concerned about, because like if you take example of Siachen Glacier, which is melting pretty fast, and this is where you have both Indian and Pakistani soldiers deployed on both sides of the border. And they are actively changing their deployment procedures on the glacier because they can't sustain what they have been doing so far. It's the same with India-China border as well, where you know, temperatures are varying, and there's also glacial retreat, which is affecting the deployment procedures. So this is something they're mostly concerned about. Not as much with the conflict aspects of it.
Risk.
You know, the risks aspect is something they leave it to the civilian, you know, machinery to deal with it. They don't really engage with these aspects. Maybe in the conflict areas like Jammu and Kashmir, where the military has traditionally played also sort of a governance actor role, because the civilian governance is pretty weak. So, you know, those areas, they have always been providing, say, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief when there is a huge disaster that happens or something like that. But there are active examples of military engagement and, you know, the conflict example, like, I mean, you know, if I have to speak with evidence, of course, like the ambassadors also mentioned, it's very difficult to say what kind of role does climate change play in exacerbating a conflict in that sense. But if we take the case of Pakistan, there is evidence that shows that some of the extremist organizations have used disasters to increase their legitimacy, where the government has failed to provide relief. And you know, this space is kind of used or exploited by these groups to gain legitimacy and enhance their presence in recruitment and everything else, which is something that is also being experienced in other parts of South Asia as well, but it is not actively like talked about, or there's not evidence to say, okay, this is something that needs to be dealt with as well.
Yeah. And I think I can add to that also in the research, for instance, by Tobias van Bossa from our institute, you could really see that also that IS in Iraq and Syria has really used water dam access as a strategic entry point, but also for the recruitment purposes of the recruits, and they were also active in these fields where the environmental and water conditions were not so well developed, and they used this to extend their influence. Is that also something you observe with Al-Shabaab?
Absolutely. In the case of Al-Shabaab, we're seeing that they are exploiting the conditions people are living in, right? So the lack of sustenance, the lack of living like a life in dignity where they can make a living doing a normal job, for example, is pretty much non-existing in rural areas. So young people in particular find themselves usually in very difficult situations where they have to decide, okay, where can I and how can I actually feed my family? And Al-Shabaab is using this. We are also seeing that certain regions in Somalia are completely cut off by Al-Shabaab, and in this case, this links back to the military question. So people are forced to navigate the space where the Al-Shabaab is and where the military, for example, is, and key resource areas being cut off by the Al-Shabaab or from the military, causing them then to be in very difficult and insecure places where they are in danger, actually. In the case of Al-Shabaab, maybe in relationship to how they use it at the end, they have very persuasive arguments in the sense that young people can find a living and then, of course, are being radicalized through other means, right? So Al-Shabaab is using this when it comes to changing this around, maybe involving the military in this. One has to question the reception of the military in Somalia, which is very difficult, particularly when it's forces coming from the outside. Al-Shabaab is using this narrative as well. This foe coming from the outside, trying to disrupt the Somali community. So questionable, maybe difficult question, like aspect when it comes to military in Somalia.
May I add something to that?
No, I actually wanted to to round up, and I wanted to give our guest from Iraq actually the final word, because that also brings me to the point that local militia, local terrorist groups sometimes use, let's say, access to water and issues. But that the NGOs that protest against this are sometimes under threat. And this is also something we see in Iraq and in other places in the world. Well, we just see in the case of the journalists in Brazil that were murdered. Is that something you would also still like to bring to the table? And then we close off, because I think that's also an important element that, let's say, the climate change movement as we know it in our Western societies, that this is really different also in other contexts in the world. And we have an interview with somebody from Somalia Greenpeace just published on the Planetary Security website, which will also point out this importance also of this local journalists, investigative journalism, and NGOs to be active also in this space.
Thank you so much. It's a sensitive question, but to talk about militias and what's happened there back home. Actually, to talk about environment in Iraq, especially, and even I think around all the world now, to talk about environment or water issues, you should take it from the political perspective, economical perspective, and social perspective, and later you will come to the environmental perspective. So if you want to touch the political perspective, you will go to the deep with the who's controlling this area. Especially in Iraq, there is a lot of area now. We have like Sawa Lake is one of the famous lake in Iraq and around the world. It's feeding by the groundwater, and now it's drought completely. The Iraqi government, they said it's a drought because of the climate change. But when we go and do our investigation and see what's happening here, we saw there is a lot of like militias and like big control people. They can control the area around. They make this water wheels to bring all the water from the underground to use it for the agriculture land, which is illegal to use this kind of water without the permission from the Ministry of Water Resources, that they use it to just do the irrigation for their lands, which is they're using really old-fashioned and old method of irrigation system from the Somalian time for 4,000 years ago. They use it still now to flood the area with the water, and that's it. In a time that we don't have drinkable water in a lot of south part of Iraq. So that's one of the story, how is that those kind of militias control the area, or sometimes even they control the river by the fish farm that they have, especially in Mosul, or how they control the river, that we don't have access to swim in the river because they are controlling the river from Daesh, which means ISIS, but we don't call them ISIS, we call them Daesh. Which is really hard to work there in a lot of parts. In south or north, even in an area which is not under control of Daesh, it is still During Daesh time, they were using the water as a weapon, especially in Ramadi Dam and Tabaqa Dam in Syria also. They tried to control Mosul Dam also to use it as a weapon. But now the militias, they start to use it in the same way. The Kurdistan region, they are think again to use the water harvesting to cut the water for the south part also again. So all this kind of things.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much. I think we have a very rich discussion. I see a lot of people also from Iraq who want to respond, but I'm afraid we have to close off. But as I mentioned, we have some drinks and I think we can continue this conversation. There is a colleague from Wageningen University from Iraq and then also from the Iraqi embassy here in The Hague. And as you see, I think this also points out the importance of having such dialogues and bringing different actors together to talk about these issues and see the interlinkages and also the importance to reflect on them and to see where we can build positive alliances. So I would like to thank the speakers. I realized that we pressed a lot into 1 hour on this warm Friday afternoon, but I really appreciated that you all made it, wanted to contribute in this talk show style setup. Which is not always the easiest, but very much appreciated. And we hope to see you all back in the future. And also thank you all for participating. Maybe a big round of applause. And then the drinks are in room 2. That's just here behind the forum.